My name's Charles Pluck. I'm General Manager of Digital Transformation at ThinkTalks. And online here, we've got Aditya, who works as an intern in ThinkTalks with the Parsons Design School, who we have a strategic relationship. And over the past 6 months, we've been developing some really interesting views about how do we move from the mainstream articulation and acknowledgement that digital ethics is important to actually doing something about it. And how do we actually enact it in organisations? And that's the focus of today's presentation. So on screen, you'll see a gentleman. His name is Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison was someone pretty instrumental in the use of electricity. There were many others before him who led to the identification and creation and adoption of electricity. But one of the really interesting aspects of it is it took about 80 years from the first mainstream acknowledgement that electricity is something that can be useful to actually getting societal benefits out of it. And in the meantime, there were some pretty horrific things that happened, such as hooking up children to electricity to change their brain waves, all sorts of other very challenging ethical issues. And it took 80 years. And it got me thinking, do we really have 80 years left as a society and as a planet to rapidly adopt some of the technology innovations that can solve some of our most pressing problems and opportunities? So problems around climate change, opportunities around economic advancement, opportunities around diversity. Can we really wait 80 years? Or do we as designers need to do something now to actually address that? And that's the focus of today's presentation. So at ThinkTalks, our focus is on achieving and driving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it's really why, for me, this presentation and this thinking is really critical to engage with peers and start a discussion and start some action around the space. So first thing, obviously, just acknowledging is that technology is embedded in many aspects of our society. And indeed, it has been since the invention of fire, right? And probably beforehand. So it is a mainstream aspect of society. However, the role of technology is dual. So, there can be negative sides, there can be positive sides, there can be stuff in between. And I think that acknowledgement is really, really critical. So what we started to do was take a bit of a pulse and see, what is the community saying and what are experts saying about the role of technology? And one of the things that I've noted on some of the social media platforms and some of the current discussions is a really polarised view. Technology is good, technology is bad. But what really concerns me around this is some of the facts that are starting to come through, such as 32% of experts believing that technology will create more harm than good. And to me, that's a real worrying thing. If we think back around electricity, so without technology to solve some of these advantages or some of these opportunities and address some of these challenges, what are we going to do? Just rely on good luck? Just stumble through? Just work it out as we go? If that's our future, I'm not too sure that's the future I want to leave my children and society and generations to come. So the next part is just to appreciate, that technology can be a black mirror. Sometimes dark, sometimes light, sometimes bad, sometimes good, etc. So, I think we need to really just have a sense of what it means and what we can do and what our position is about technology and about what we say and about how we use it and how we promote it. And the reason for that is that technology has absolutely proven to be transformative. So one of my most influential books is one called Factfulness. And its whole ethos is notwithstanding what we think, right, and what we understand, that the world is manifestly a better place now than it has been for many, many, many generations. And that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen, because they do, and they'll continue to happen. It doesn't mean that there aren't, critical challenges. Climate is an obvious one. But when you look at the facts of society now compared to 50 years ago, it is almost universally, not wholly, but almost universally, a significantly better place than we'd ever thought. Right? So some of those things there, 70 years, the average global life expectancy for those born in 2016 was 72 years. Before the advent of technology, it was about 30 years. So do we want to make a choice, I suppose is my question. Do we want to make a choice of either stopping technology? And most people say, oh no, we're not going to stop technology. Of course, that's not what we mean. But I think as designers and people who interact online and who espouse views and talking about the dangers of artificial intelligence, the dangers of technology, absolutely. There are real dangers of technology. There's a thing called a wheel that's on a car that leads to car accidents, that leads to death. But we're not going to say, well, we won't have any cars in the future and we won't use wheels, right? And people say, well, of course, don't be patronising. But it's what I've seen is in a lot of the discourse, the challenge is that many of the views are polarised. And how can we constructively work within that frame to address that balance, to look at how do we shorten the life cycle to actually adopt technology in a way that produces benefits while minimising dangers and minimising risks. It's not going to stop risks and stop dangers. There will be bad outcomes, absolutely. But as a society, how else are we going to solve some of these challenges and jump on some of these opportunities? So that really leads us to the aspect of digital ethics, which is the focus today, is that digital ethics is a way and a means of framing and working through those issues. And what's been interesting is I think most people would understand now that digital ethics is important and there are some core principles, some difference around what some of those principles are, but at a high level, most of those are known. So things such as it being safe, about being helpful, making sure that it's inclusive, making sure that it's fair and that there are measures for that fairness and that equity, making sure that it's transparent so people understand what's being used, why and how, and they've got a voice in that. Making sure that it's accountable, so the use of technology is accountable. And that cuts both ways, both in terms of benefits, but also in terms of risks. So that's the starting point. Many of those, those digital ethics principles are understood, known, and we say, yeah, let's work towards those. So we've been working with Aditya from the Parsons Design School to work through, do a bit of secondary research about, well, how are companies actually enacting this? Right? What are they doing in a practical manner to take these words, this rhetoric, and start to put into a bit of reality? So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Aditya, who will just talk through some of our research that we've undertaken, and secondly, to start to introduce a broad operating model that we've co-designed about what you can do and what an actual operating model for digital ethics could look like. Thanks, Aditya.
Thank you so much, Charles. So as you guys can see on the screen, the research that we did was looking at all the various business sectors that operated within the digital sort of domain. And the first one, beyond the principles that we thought that we were coming across, was some companies, or in fact, most companies that we came across, were creating their own core principles. Now, what these look like are, these principles provide a clear structure for companies to assess their ethical issues and practices in terms of how their businesses are operating and how they're hiring, how their employees are going through their sort of day-to-day, how they're handling sensitive information, and what kind of laws and legalities they're sort of taking care of. It reflects the internal sort of structure of a company, how they're operating. And the way they do this is by the senior and C-suite staff within the companies list cultural sort of shifts and guidelines that then trickle down to the entire organization. The main focus here, what they attempt is to sort of ingrain these cultural sort of shifts, these ethical sort of guidelines throughout their day-to-day. And it becomes a very important part of their company structure. Companies then can operate much better beyond that. The next sort of strategy we have is collaborating with external teams. This is very important in terms of forming good partnerships with external stakeholders in order to sort of figure out how there could be a co-design opportunity in the domain of digital ethics. One such university, Georgetown University, is doing this really well by creating a Center for Digital Ethics. It's a university-wide collaboration sort of group that is committed to building new sort of relationships with companies that are sort of working in the digital ethics space, and also sort of guiding this emerging field within their university as well. The way they do this is generally by recruiting and collaborating with leaders, public teams, local teams as well, and both working in the public and private sectors to develop new sort of knowledge pieces, creating knowledge and working in those knowledge sectors. And next we have is defining structures. Now, this is more or less a way to understand the capabilities that a company can operate in the domain of digital ethics. This looks at developing their current product pipeline, how they're operating, who they're hiring, etc. Deloitte, which is one such company that is creating their own sort of structure based on resources, their ways of gathering and knowing knowledge, and the kind of technology they're doing. The one such sort of strategy that they have is they employ a rule book of company values, how they're hiring, and where those skill sets of each hires are being allocated in their company sort of operating column, what kind of products they're building. So that gives them a clear overview of being accountable with their ethical space. And then finally, and moving on, we have the advisory panel sort of strategy. This is quite obvious as it seems. It's creating a structure within your organization, a group of people who would sort of oversee things from an ethics standpoint. They look at, the idea is to have people from various backgrounds, from big data, law, digital health, digital governance, ethics, who bring a holistic perspective on how a company could sort of operate. Their consultant sort of guidelines are very important. MERS is a company that is doing this by having discussions, holding meetings, having employee reports to sort of get a holistic perspective of how the company is operating as a whole and how their sort of their hires, their employees are also working on what products they're building. It brings like a distance of objectiveness of how they operate in the digital ethics space. And then after that, we have embedded ethics, which is a process by which the product development pipeline is essentially embedded with digital ethics. Best practices are adopted at every step of the way through quality analysis, quality assessments to better assess how well they're defining and designing their product features and sort of go-to-market strategies. Avenade is a company that is doing this through teamwork, have made like an ethics bureau within their company, and as well as created structures within their process to either assess their ethics and create a checks and balances of how well they're sort of building their products. And through that, our take was that with the rise of the metaverse and the increased use of digital sort of technology, it is very imperative that we find strategies to address this digital landscape. These approaches that we have sort of listed in the prior slides are suitable for companies in this space, but we realize there's a need for digital ethics and a need to sort of change the mindset of how we operate. And now we cue in this co-designed digital ethics operating model that me and Charles have worked on. What you see next is a hemispherical sort of operating model, which operates on the mindset hemisphere. That takes a look at core businesses, organization structures, your customers and stakeholders, and your external networks outside of the company. This forms the mindset hemisphere. And the other half, we have the action hemisphere, which sort of goes through the active thinking, experimentation, feedback mechanisms, and partnerships that sort of form a best sort of pairing with the existing mindset hemisphere. So now let's take a look at the mindset hemisphere. Now, in the mindset hemisphere, you have your core businesses. What this essentially does is allows you to use this as a toolkit to ensure that your company culture is enforced from an ethical lens. That entails forming new regulations, guidelines, and having a very experimentative approach to keep improving on your ethical sort of guidelines and standpoints. On top of that layer, we have the organization structures. Organization structures are a way to sort of track and monitor the execution of the implementation stages. Not only does it help you get a firm grasp of what kind of work you're doing, but it ensures that you can track the growth of the ethics that you've implemented in an experimental standpoint. So they feed off each other, core businesses and the organization structure. Next, we have the customer and stakeholders layer. Now, what this does is ensures that you use a human-centered approach to solving your customers' day-to-day problems through an ethical lens, obviously. You can measure success by the way of your customer acquisition, your other sort of existing metrics, but the ethical guidelines that you've adopted in your prior two layers are shown most here in the way that you sort of define the kind of privacy laws you create, the kind of ethical laws your products follow. Essentially, the objective of this layer is to build trust with your customers. So you know as a company where you stand ethically, and they themselves are aware of where you stand ethically. And finally, on the last layer is the external network. Now, it's good and all that as a company that you follow ethical standpoints, you create an ethical culture sheet, you have ethical practices, but it doesn't work if you have partners who aren't ethically sound. So this stage allows you to sort of use this mindset to create good partnerships with companies who are operating on an ethical standpoint, who might have similar or different ethical sort of strategies. It ensures and keeps things a bit more interesting in ways to collaborate better. And it also allows you to find new companies who are working in the ethical space. They're sort of, it ensures that they get more visibility in terms of how you form partnerships and allows other people to sort of see them better. And now with that, Charles, I will hand it over to you for the next hemisphere section.
Thanks, Aditya. And it's been, a pleasure to work with you around this space, and it is such a fascinating area, and really look forward to continue to work with you in the future. So we go from thinking to the action hemisphere. And I think, as designers, one of the things that ThinkPlace is, its journey has been focusing on not just designing, but implementing. So it's about teaming and partnering with firms that are delivering solutions that are changing society. And it's really important that as we work through this digital ethics and how we're going to optimize the benefits of emerging technologies, is that we translate it into action. So the first component of that action hemisphere is to absolutely engage in active thinking, and it's really about taking that thinking hemisphere into action. Secondly, it's about experimentation, and this is a critical one, and this is also part that's very, very challenging for society. Is we're going to need to accept that mistakes will be made, and that there will be negative consequences from those. But without that, we won't even try, and we won't be able to progress. And the question is, how long can we wait as a society to create the perfect system where we try and rule out all the negative potential consequences and then start implementation? So the challenge as designers is how can we make them do it in a way that reduces the timeframes, but also minimises the risks. And those risks will be minimised for some at an acceptable level, and for some it will be at an unacceptable level. So the level of leadership that's going to be required across all sectors to realise that very, very tricky balance. Thirdly, around building in feedback mechanisms, and in particular real-time feedback mechanisms that are data-driven, that are giving both alerts to problems and issues, but also are starting to promote the benefits and allow people to actually partake and get some of the benefits of the emerging technologies. And finally, around partnerships. And I think as Aditya mentioned, this is about how do we work within the ecosystem, because this is not a linear model of, A follows B. This is all about complex ecosystems working as a part of within that ecosystem, forming strategic partnerships, using those feedback mechanisms, in particular to look at what sources of value are being created between, from, and across the ecosystem, to work through how are we going, how quickly are we adopting these technologies, how quickly can we spot and address problem areas, how quickly can we spot and progress areas of opportunity. So we started off with Thomas Edison, and we're going to finish with Thomas Edison. So at the start, the story was about the 80 years cycle of electricity, and how to start to shorten that. And whereabouts do we go from here? And I think Thomas Edison probably said it best: genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So we look forward to working with you, and thank you very much for your time. See you.